Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin our session. You're requested to switch off your mobile phones or put them to the silent mode. We would greatly appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Respected guests, good morning and Assalamu Alaikum. I'm Tayyaba Akil and I extend a very warm welcome to all our guests at the third day of the 3rd Islamabad Literature Festival. Wishing all of you a wonderful day ahead. Now we begin our session titled Art and Culture Diplomacy. The panelists are Bilal Tanweer, Paul Harding, Judith Ravin, and Hassan. Fizza Hassan, I beg your pardon. And the session will be moderated by Ayesha, Fazlur, Rahman. I would just request you to please come on to the stage. Ayesha Fazlur Rahman is a technical advisor, curriculum and textbook board reform to GIZ Pakistan, a Fulbright alumnus. She holds a master's in education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Prior to her present assignment, she had been a middle school teacher for almost a decade. The duration of the session will be 60 minutes. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. Please keep your questions short and precise. That's very important. You are further requested to raise your hands and the microphone will be brought forward to you. Enjoy yourselves. Over to you, Ayesha.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me through the mic? Can you hear me through the mic now? Yes? Okay. Thank you for being here this Sunday morning, and before we start with the session, we'd like to observe a few moments of silence for the sad and tragic death of Sabine Mahmood, the director of the second floor, and we respect her and we respect the struggle that she was a part of, and we're going to observe a few moments of silence for her. Okay. See. I'm going to introduce our panel today. To my left is Mr. Paul Harding. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for his book that he wrote in 2010, his first novel, Tinkers. And he's also a musician, apart from being an author. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Penn Bingham Fellowship for Writers, among other honors. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages. He has taught at Harvard University, Grinnell College, and the University of Iowa, where he is currently a visiting professor at the Writers' Workshop. Next to Paul is Fizza Hassan, another school teacher. So we have a lot of teachers, lecturers, professors here. Fizza is one of the founding members of the performance company Theatre Wale, which evolved from a group she brought together in 2005. She has worked with Theatre Wale as director, actor, and producer, and has been involved with almost every one of the group's productions to date. The latest of which is the Voices of Partition project, which is actually ongoing these days, and there have been 2 sessions already?
That's right. This is the last performance.
Tonight is the last performance. She also works regularly on theatrical activities with young people in schools and universities. And then we have Bilal Tanweer, who is an honorary fellow of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Bilal is a writer and translator. His debut novel, The Scatter Here, is too great won the 2014 Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize, and has been shortlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature 2015. Bilal was one of the grantor's new voices and a recipient of the Pen Translation Fund grant for his translation of Muhammad Khalid Akhtar's Chakiwara Mein Visal, which is a forthcoming project. Next to Bilal is Judith Ravin, Cultural Attaché, Public Affairs Section, US Embassy, Islamabad, Pakistan. Judith Ravin is in Pakistan for a 2-year assignment as Country Cultural Attaché at the US Embassy in Islamabad. Before joining the US Department of State, she worked in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as an editor, translator, and journalist. She did undergraduate work at universities in France and Spain and has a master's in Romance languages and literature from Harvard University. So I'm going to start with the session now. I'd like to hear your views about, in the light of what happened to Sabine, I'd like to hear how you see art, whether it's the written word, whether it's music, whether it's theatrical performance. How do you see art as an effective tool for leveraging a change in mindsets? I mean, we've seen some of the challenges that befall people who are trying to achieve that, and we also know that there are rewards and achievements also along the way. So I'd like for you to speak to that. Judith, would you like to start, please?
Sure, thank you, Ayesha. So I'll first start by saying that Sabine Mahmood was a product of cultural exchange. She, for her leadership qualities, she was selected to participate in an international visitor leadership program, which is a very prestigious global-wide program of the U.S. Department of State. And with poignant irony, I'll point out that the title of her program was Equal Rights for Citizens. I was looking up last night to see some of the things she said after the trip. So a couple of years ago, I found qualities that she pointed out which were inspirational in her formative years, and I think they're qualities that we look for in cultural exchange. I think cultural exchange, whether it's the arts or any other subject, what it ultimately does is it portrays our values and our society and our policy. So Sabine Mahmood said that the 6 things that she has been guided by are discipline and retaining the focus, taking risks, the power of intuition, to accept failure gracefully, to challenge oneself endlessly, and to keep the faith. And anyone who has ever been on an experience of cultural exchange, these are grounded baselines that you really need to do to get through the experience, because it's a marriage of who you are and your identity and that culture that you immerse yourself in.
Thank you, Judith. Bilal, would you like to speak to the concept of art as a tool for change?
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, you can hear me now. Thank you. So I'm going to take like slightly contrarian point of view here, because I think that we have to make this distinction between art in its production and art in its reception, and art in its instrumentalization. And I think that, you know, I'm where I am located, I am a producer of art, I am a writer. So I'm not necessarily very concerned about changing other people's mindsets. What I am particularly concerned about, and again as somebody who writes stories, who writes novels, I'm very concerned about interrogating a particular subjectivity, trying to understand it as deeply as I can, and obviously, you know, that subjectivity is radically different from your own. So what you are trying to go for is trying to understand or get a sense of truth, the larger truth, by investigating a very narrow subjective experience of the world. So I'm not, you know, and I'm not entirely comfortable with this kind of instrumentalization of art where you're saying that, you know, you say that this is a tool for something else. I mean, I tend to see it as a kind of an end, but I think that what is productive about it, and I think is that it opens up a space, right? And we have to like think a little carefully about what sort of a space it opens up. And the kind of a space that art opens up is a kind of a space for empathy. It is a space where you can enter and experience something that you would not experience, inhabiting the kind of worldview, the kind of life, the kind of body, the kind of place that you do. So what that leads to, perhaps that leads to a better understanding of something, perhaps that leads to a change, perhaps that doesn't lead to a change. But I don't think that the central point is ever, going directly to change somebody. I don't think that work is done by propaganda. And I think that Nazis did a great job by using that sort of art. I think all national governments, do that. So I think that one has to keep that distinction in mind.
So you mean the author has to be true to his own truths and represent that, and
not
that
just to
will
your own
affect-
truth. You're going from your truths to a truth that you do not understand. That is the premise. I think where you are constructing something from is a point of naivety. When you create art, you do not create it from a point of authority. That is a big difference between art and, say, criticism, right? Because when you write criticism, when you write about art, you will do it from some point of authority. But when you are producing art, you are producing it from a point of complete naivety. I don't know what it is to be in the body of an ambulance driver who's just seen a bomb blast, right? But what is that experience about? I do not know, but I try to access it imaginatively. I try to access it in any number of ways that I can, and then I might or might not succeed. Again, these are all murky questions for an artist.
Thank you, Bilal. Fizza, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I tend to agree with Bilal in that, all art is extremely subjective. No matter what the medium might be, it could be music, it could be, painting, it could be writing. Anything that starts off with the objective to moralize or to teach a lesson, would we classify it as art at all? I'm not sure. Right, so I think the best thing that art does is provoke thought, provoke reflection, and perhaps lead to dialogue. So in that way, perhaps we are talking about changing mindsets in a certain way, because we are teaching people to think about certain things, to think about, like he said, what it means to be in somebody else's shoes, to think about issues that may exist and conflicts that may exist between people. They could be internal, they could be, So I think that, where provoking thought, reflection, dialogue is concerned, yes. But other than that, I don't think that the purpose of art is to change a mindset.
But it creates an openness to different perspectives.
Absolutely, that it does.
Thank you, Fizza. Paul.
Yeah, I think I agree with the other panelists. One of the distinctions for me is that when I try to create art, what I'm trying to do is descriptive rather than explanatory.
Yeah.
I think if you have art, if your motive is to try to explain things, usually explaining things means to explain them away, or to try to. There's something to me that always smacks of coercion if you're trying to explain something, because then you're trying to dictate to somebody else what they're to think about, or how they're supposed to think about something, which is then, one step away from, if not already, propaganda, or, So to me, it's the idea of taking that subjectivity or whatever and creating a description of a subjective experience that is of an order of complexity commensurate with the size of the reader's mind, who's then going to be, participating in that, so that things like recognition or revelation become more the experience of when I'm thinking of my reader, I'm thinking I want her experience to be recognition, revelation. Even if I'm writing about some guy from New England, that idea of like pushing through into some kind of universality, so people can recognize something of their own human experience without being coerced into it.
Thank you, Paul. So when I was preparing for this session and I was Googling all of you, the panelists, Paul, I came across something, a set of tips on writing that you have put on the internet. Is that you?
It might be.
Paul Harding. So one thing that's mentioned there is the imaginative truths. And how is that different from truths, the factual truth? What's your concept of the imaginative truth?
Well, to me, it's just this. It's a kind of ongoing, dynamic sort of investigation that I'm always. It's very open-ended. It's sort of a mystery to ponder but never solve. But in the United States, anyways, there's this habit of equating fact with the truth. With thinking of the two as a synonym, as opposed to something like imaginative truth, which can be as powerful as factual truth, if not. And that, within the realm of art. So, for example, I take one of my own favorite novels, like Herman Melville's Moby Dick. That's true to me. When I read that novel, it's true. While I'm reading it, it's as if it were fact. And for that book. The imaginative truth of that book cannot be or would not be confirmed by them finding the Pequod, the whaling boat that they were on. And I also think that imaginative truth has to do with that subjectivity, which is you being able to, you having the freedom to and the ability to account for yourself in your own language, your own experience. Of your humanity, of your given humanity, with the freedom of not having to be told what to make of it by anybody else.
Thank you. Fizza, you're also working on a very important topic, the play that you just mentioned, Voices of Partition. How do you see it as a representative of the imaginative truth as opposed to the factual truths? Or do you...
Well, this play that we've put together is actually based on true stories. So one of the objectives behind this performance was to get these stories to a public. These are stories that are unheard so far.
For the audience, can you just tell a little about the topic?
Yes. Well, we've been working for a while on a project that we call Voices of Partition. And what we've been doing over the last few months is collect oral histories of partition survivors. So we've been out between Multan and Rawalpindi, Islamabad. We've been touring, collecting stories from people who are now very old and who have childhood memories of the partition itself. Those stories were collected and archived, and from those stories we chose some that we've fashioned into a script for performance. Now, it's very difficult sometimes because we've wanted to remain true, in fact, as far as possible to the actual people's stories. But what you find is that to be true also to the art of theater, sometimes there are things that you change and modify and merge. And so the stories that emerge are absolutely true in that what they reflect may not always be 100% factual, because you take snippets from different places and you merge them to create a new story. But what is very true is the trauma, the emotion that comes through, the things that people faced. So we are telling the truth, but we may not be telling it, the way it was told to us, from A to Z. This is what happened, then this happened, then this happened. This is not how it's portrayed. But the story itself on stage comes through as absolutely true to what the experience of people was at that time.
So in essence, it's true.
In essence, it is absolutely true, yes.
Thank you, Fizza. Bilal, you already spoke about the truth, but if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, I think that I'm just going to extend what Paul and Fizza just said. I think Raymond Chandler said this really interesting thing. He says that a telephone directory is full of facts, right? But what sort of a truth does it tell you? Right? And there is a point there, right? In order to arrive at an understanding of something, we need to give it some sort of shape. And the shape that what you were alluding to and what Paul you were talking about is the shape that we work with. The shape is called a story, right? Or a narrative. This is how we make things legible to a particular audience, right? So in a particular narrative, when you put certain facts, you give precedence to certain things, you kind of conceal certain things, you emphasize certain things, you don't emphasize certain things, right? And that part of, and you do that because, as Fizza earlier pointed out, you do that in order to, for the art of theater or for the art of storytelling, but to communicate a certain thing. And I think that that is, again, one has to, be aware of those limitations, because there are limitations that the form itself imposes on your understanding of the world. So I think that, this is what artists are essentially doing. They go from life, which is this kind of shapeless, formless thing, which does not necessarily have a good opening, middle and end, to, using that formless stuff to create something that is artificial, that is constructed, but, gives off some of the same effects that you experience in real life. So I think that movement from from actual experience to trying to represent it in some sort of and kind of give it some sort of shape, I think that's where truth is also born, but it also gets distorted, right? And I think that one has to be aware of the limitations of art and how art deceives sometimes, most of the time, in order to create the effect of the truth.
Thank you, Bilal. Bilal, would you say that when authors bring in the political context, sometimes the depth of their characters gets compromised if they are trying to bring in facts? For example, in The Scatter Here is Too Wide is about multiple characters, and they all are joined, united by a bomb blast that they are all affected by. So do you think we get the depth of character for all of them, or do you think that is somehow compromised? Are you satisfied with that?
No, I'm never satisfied. I think the book sucks, actually. But I think that I don't think that depth of character can be an end in itself, right? I mean, I think what you're going for, what your project is something else altogether. Actually, what you are trying to, you have certain concerns, you have certain questions, you are trying to interrogate certain things that you do not understand. You're trying to interrogate experiences that are completely different from yours. So you're trying to say that, look, I mean, here's a bomb blast, right? And bomb blasts gets written about in the media in a particular way, right? So in any story of a bomb blast, if you read it in the news or you watch it on television, it's flattened out in a particular way, right? So there are perpetrators, there are victims, and then there are other people who are just, and the center of it is the event itself, right? My project was that what happens if you look away from the event? What has been told to you that this is the most important thing, right? What happens if you are forced to look at it from marginal positions? People who are affected by it only marginally. People who are somebody who's, who's just passing by the site of the bomb blast, just like 5 seconds before the actual bomb blast. And what if, he's a boy who's trying to go on a date with his girlfriend, right? And they have to be back in 1 hour, but they encountered this bomb blast, right? What happens to the guy who's sitting with his old mother in the apartment block right next door? What happens to the guy who's an ambulance driver who's picking up the bodies from there, right? So again, the project was not to have depth of character. I don't think that serves any purpose. I mean, you can have depth of character but still come up with a perfectly lousy perfectly lousy novel. But I think that one has to know a little bit and try to understand what the project is and why, what are you trying to investigate, what are your questions. And I think for me the question in the novel was really, how does this look if you, and what sort of things emerge, because this sort of flattening out of a particular event naturally leads to certain questions, right? Naturally you raise questions about security. Naturally you raise questions that then involve people who are experts on security. What I'm saying is that let's ask different kinds of questions. I mean, it does affect everybody really, even people who are not there, right? Such an event is also affects them. And if we start looking at things from their point of view, what does the bomb blast look like then?
So you're basically giving a face to the faceless crowd, or showing the different faces of the faceless crowd, and that's the point of the project.
Sure, yeah.
Fizza, how do you feel about this? You are telling a very important narrative in the play that you're working on, or other plays that you have worked on. So do you think the story, the events, and the sequence of events is supreme, or do you think the character and how real they are and the minor nuances in their development, is that the point? Where would you lay the balance?
In this particular piece that we've put together, it's not about the story, it's about the stories. So what we have here are multiple stories that are coming through that have been interwoven to tell one story. So we have actually fashioned this play out of a series of monologues. So at any given point, you have one person speaking, and speaking to somebody most of the time, except that we don't see the somebody. It's not, I would say that there is a balance here between telling the actual story, telling what happened to people, and between what the impact of all that has been on people over the years. So we're looking at a very partition is an extremely complex subject to look into, because you can so easily try and oversimplify it. So here what we're trying to do is tell the actual narrative of things that happened to people, but at the same time let them emerge as people, as individual people, the faceless, voiceless people who suffered because of decisions that they had absolutely no hand in. So what happened to them? What did they go through? What is the lasting impact even today of everything that they saw? So it's very hard to actually narrow it down and say, are we telling a story? Are we depicting people? We're doing a little bit of everything.
So you're doing justice to
We're
all
trying.
aspects
It's
of
very,
it.
very hard to do justice, to a topic like this. We can only, we've only just delved beneath the surface, really. So we've tried to keep it simple. Most of all, we've tried to keep it honest. And I don't know, I think the people who've seen the play would be in a better position to give you but it's been a very, very emotional and very personal journey for all of us, because it's very hard to disconnect from these people and these stories. We're all a part of it,
Truly,
so
absolutely.
it's very hard to distance yourself and to be able to actually sit back and analyze what it is that we've done here. And it's still very, very recent. So maybe 6 months down the road, I'll probably be in a better position to sit back and say, all right, this is what we really did, this is what we achieved. Right now, it's still in the process of happening. So
it's probably changed your own concepts.
It has changed us as people more than anything else. I mean, the kind of contact we've had with people, the way we've listened to them, the things that we have heard about, the places we have seen, it's been an amazing, incredible journey. We have all emerged from this completely different people.
Thank you for sharing that, Fizza.
Thank you.
Paul, the little that I've looked at about Tinkers, I haven't been able to read the whole book. It's on my list of books to read, but it seems very introspective. It's about this old man who's dying, and it's very, very introspective. So can you speak to that? How much of the context, the social context or the political context is important, or is it the personal story and the depth of the individual's character that's more important for you as a writer?
In the case of Tinkers, the Tinkers it concerns a family loosely based on my grandfather and my great grandfather's family in the state of northern Maine in the 1920s, and there's nothing that's particularly overtly political about it, but these people live lives that would have been considered marginalized. They wouldn't have been people whose stories were included in whatever the larger narratives of the country were at that point. But I was interested more in something more like a familial consciousness. It's a very interior book. but I made the boundaries between the different characters' consciousnesses porous, and so there becomes a kind of collective experience that the novel tries to register. And I think, I mean, you know, like actually when I started trying to write fiction and wanted to figure out a way to write, you know, fiction that was sort of overtly had to do with my political beliefs, my social beliefs, all that sort of stuff. I just found that whenever I put my hand to writing narratives like that, it just instantly turned into cartoons and propaganda for whatever, you know, for whatever reason. You sort of, so then I turned back to this much more sort of metaphysical kind of writing, much more interior, much more just having to do with consciousness and how experience refracts through each individual person's mind. And I really thought that I had marginalized myself from, you know, anything that was sort of socially or politically relevant. But it's just the strangest experience having, you know, the book was very fortunate and had, you know, sort of worldly success. And I've just been, it's just been a humbling and kind of instructive experience to go around the world and find people who read these lives that from my point of view couldn't have been more provincial or regional. I mean, these people are barely literate, and have people around the world saying, oh, the mother is just like my aunt, or the uncle is just like my uncle, or we used to do that, or that's what my family was like. And so I think that somehow in a kind of backhanded or, you know, roundabout way becomes, has to do with the social and the political and all of that. But it's in a very, it's almost, I mean, I'm thinking of a line by the poet W.H. Auden that's something like, truth like love and sleep resists direct approach. So for some reason when I make art, I have to really, really write about it sort of peripherally, and then somehow or another all the most important things to me still end up sort of being suffused into the work of art. But if I go at it directly, it's like the direct gaze always just scatters the very qualities that I'm after. So I have to sort of sneak up on these things. That's a very anecdotal description too. I mean, it's, you know,
that's an interesting image of sneaking up on the truth.
pouncing on it.
Judith, I'd like to ask you to address this also. The U.S. Embassy is organizing a lot of cultural events, art events, and how do you position them in the cultural context, in the political context of the country that you're working in?
Thank you. So I know we've spoken a lot about art, which could be literature, visual and performing arts, but actually cultural diplomacy in our context is even beyond that. It includes science and women's empowerment and entrepreneurship. And when cultural diplomacy is working, it really contributes to our foreign policy goals in the country. So here in Pakistan, that's the economy and energy and education and countering extremism. Last week we had a 3-day series of concerts and workshops. It was called Music Mela. There were over 22,000 people. And I think what was really rewarding was, like everyone is saying, just through music, which is something that touches the soul and transcends boundaries and, you know, and enters categories of diversity and tradition and modernity, and that just many people of all generations were moved by something that was only its second year. So we went from maybe, you know, 1,000, 1,500 each night last year to over 7,500 people each night. And we do this to bring Pakistan, the United States, into an arena where there's openness of dialogue. You know, through culture, you don't need to speak the same language. You can just soul to soul relate to someone, and we do many programs like that. So actually Voices of Partition is another. The Iowa Writers Program is another. And it's been really rewarding because if you try the direct route, it's often, you know, more challenging. But in this alternate route, you touch someone directly.
Thank you, Judith. You've sort of addressed this already, but I'd like to hear it from you in more detail. So do you think the purpose of art do you have a purpose of art or multiple purposes of art in mind? Do you think it's supposed to be cathartic, or do you think it's supposed to be informative, or do you think it's supposed to be a bit of both, or do you think it's supposed to just tell a story that's entertaining and that hooks the reader and engages the reader or the viewer in the case of drama? What is the objective? What gives you a sense of achievement as an author, as a drama producer?
Paul, you want to start?
Oh, great. No. I think of art, I mean, so this is all very totally anecdotal, subjective, but when I make art, I just think of the process of art is as valid and as authentic a method and means of human inquiry into human experience as any other that exists. So I, put it up there along with science. I put it up there along with philosophy, that sort of thing. It's an epistemology. It is putting pressure on bringing a certain type of attention. In the case of art, it's aesthetic. It's putting to bear, putting pressure, an aesthetic pressure on observing and describing human experience in order to try to come up with visions that seem true, and that sort of loops back into the imaginative truth. They are works of imagination, but they are works that, if they succeed aesthetically on their own terms, in the case of writing, my readers will recognize something that is true, and that just as a writer, I'm just trying to reproduce. I mean, I mentioned this yesterday in an event, but as a writer, I'm just trying to reproduce in my readers my favorite experience as a reader, which is just you finish a work, a poem, a story, a novel, a chapter, a phrase, and you just put it down, and you simultaneously realize what I've just read is absolutely true. I've always known it's true, and I've never seen anybody else put it into words.
Thank you, Paul. Fizza, what gives you your sense of achievement as an artist?
Well, I think in a way theatre is different from
Absolutely.
a novel or a play, in that it's a shared experience. It's live, it's right there, right now. It's the moment that is shared and lived by not just the person who's performing or the person who wrote it, it's by everybody who's there. So I think what is really, really powerful in theatre is to make that connection, and to know that you've made it, because you know that. As a performer, you know when you've got your audience with you and when you don't. And I think that shared experience is something that is felt, that cannot perhaps be put into words, but it is when everybody in a given space thinks as one in a way and becomes one with the truth, I think. And there are those moments. It's not something that you sustain over hours and hours, but those moments happen, and those moments are what it's all about, I think.
That sounds beautiful, Fizza. It must be amazing to experience that.
It is, trust me.
Thank you for sharing that. Bilal, no place to hide, Bilal. You have to answer this now.
Yeah. No, I think that, just starting out with a very personal kind of a incident. I mean, I was drawn to writing stories because I realized, I did like this broad degree in humanities. And again, I could have done, I was at LUMS and I could have done philosophy. I was interested in philosophy. I could have done political science, very interested in that, But I think at some level I realized what a fraudulent exercise it all was, being an academic was. Because I think that, you realize that you can make a set of argument, any argument that you want using the same sources, right? So then, and again, none of it actually helped me account for my experience that I was actually having. I mean, so much of this intellectual exercise was being expended into doing things that had no, in some sense, value for my person and for my actual experience of the world. In fact, my education was taking me away from actually comprehending and engaging with the reality that I actually inhabited. So, I really felt that I was alienated from my surroundings much more. I was being able to communicate with people around me much less. I did not have a language because I was losing the language with which to communicate with people out on the street. I was uncomfortable walking out on the street. So I just felt that this sort of education is probably, not the right way to go. And I then, and I stumbled upon writing stories through some sort of, I used to read, but I never used to write. Because there was some sort of a short story competition, and I sent something in, and I got selected, and then there was a workshop, and then Kamila Shamsi conducted that workshop out of a similar kind of a cultural exchange event. And that was the first time I actually realized, I was third year in my second year in my undergrad, first time in my life I realized that you could actually do this, like this is a thing, you can write stories. So that's when when I was done doing the undergrad, I realized that this is what actually helps me account for most of my lived experience. And I think that is something I still take very seriously. I'm teaching a course this term on cities, and it's on experience and representation, how cities are experienced and how they're represented. And again, one of the things that comes back again and again is that, literary writers, people who write stories, people who are artists, who are constructing from these points of naivety, as I said earlier, they have something to tell you that perhaps other sociologists might not be able to tell you. And I think that it comes forth so clearly in the class because the way we have structured the course is that students are required to step out and spend time in the city, and then come back and try to find ways to represent it. Right? You can write any genre, you can use any medium, right? But try to account for the complexity of the 2 hours that you actually spend in a public park, right? In what ways those spaces are gendered, what ways those spaces are class coded, what ways those spaces have their own modes of behaviors and so on. Try to account for, and on top of that, try to account for your experience being there. So I mean, most students actually then revert to fiction, right? Because that gives them a way to account for the complexity of their experience that other modes simply do not allow. And so I think that, I take this very seriously, and obviously, you get slagged off in the academy by you're just like a writer. It is okay, man, I'm just a writer. But yeah, I mean, I think that I take that very seriously, and I take that, what we do as writers very seriously.
Thank you, Bilal. Judith, what is the purpose of art for you? And you can speak as cultural attaché, and you can also speak as an author, because you also sometimes have been writing. So I'd like to hear.
Wow, art. I think art opens the dialogue. I think art is emotion. I think it's that space where people can come together and ask questions, or the very piece will ask an interior question that they didn't realize was occupying their thoughts. I think as a consumer of art, I agree with what's been said. There's a before and after having experienced a piece of art, reading, seeing a painting. That becomes part of who one is. If the art is well done, then it's transformative. As someone who produces something, for me, it's a way of processing the experiences I have. I think I'm very, very fortunate. Before I became a diplomat, I traveled extensively, and now I continue that. And every place I've ever touched, or rather every place I've ever been, has touched me, and I need to share that with people that have no idea of the realities I live. And so for me, that's a way to tell people that within this environment there are realities that you can't imagine, and they're just as human as things that you may experience, but they're in a very different context. And so that's how I do. That's how I process my reality.
Thank you, Judith. We're going to open the floor for questions now from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, do we have people with, yes, we have people with mics to go around. There's a gentleman at the back.
I had thought I should think about what to say, but I would like, I do write facts rather than fiction, but there is of course a blurred distinction between the two, and scientists would use examples, case studies, maybe in-depth studies of 10 persons or 20 persons, and the doctor gets a PhD, and so on. So, and in order to get the truth, we need the in-depth, and I think, and we also need the feelings, the emotions, all these things that statistics and facts cannot tell us. So, and then of course in diplomacy one would probably, and in maybe also researchers, writers, other artists would like to say, I have seen this, I want to tell you. Or, I am looking at this, I want to do it together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a comment, not a question. Thank you. Let's take a couple of more questions, and then if you want a particular panelist to answer the question, please mention their name. Or if it's from the whole panel, you can mention that also.
It's about the imaginative truth and the factual truth. There may be many kinds of truth, like false truth, wrong truth, maybe. But imaginative or perceived truth and factual truth, the difference between these two has been beautifully expressed by Sayyid Muhammad Hassan Jafri when he says about abstract art के मलबे से ये दौलत निकली जिसको समझा था अनन्नास वो औरत निकली नक्शे महबूब मुसव्विर ने सजा रखा था मैं ये समझा कि तपाई पे खड़ा रखा था. Thank you very much.
शुक्रिया जी. बेटा आपके पीछे है वहाँ पे जेंटलमैन.
In a way, this is also a bit of a statement, but there's a question involved, so bear with me, please, just for a moment. At the beginning of this discussion, there was a distinction made between propaganda and art, and yes, that makes sense. Propaganda bad, art good. Yet I'm also thinking of the filmmakers like Eisenstein, inspired by the Russian Revolution, Leni Riefenstahl of Germany, who was a naked propagandist for the Nazi Party and yet a great filmmaker, or even the great Madonnas of Raphael, commissioned by various people, including the church. It sometimes gets very hard to say what is propaganda and what is not. I think the touchstone, and here I turn to Paul Harding, that touchstone of what is aesthetically valid or aesthetically, and I would like a comment on you on that, a little more enlargement from you, Paul Harding, on that aesthetic, what's the term used? Something has to be aesthetically correct. I forget exactly the term you used, but can you just amplify on that?
Yeah, well, this is, I mean, part of my life as an artist is taking these incredibly complicated questions and, you can endlessly remodel them and think about them, and it's very difficult to make, it's actually fraudulent to make any sort of final conclusive pronouncement about them. One of the way I'm always thinking about John Keats's formulation that truth is beauty, beauty is truth, and the idea that what is it that you find is true, you know, and how, when you describe to yourself what you think is true, is that beautiful, you know, and you know, because there are very many things that I think are true that are very difficult to call beautiful, you know. So, but so something like Leni Riefenstahl's, you know, like those may be technically beautiful works, but they're, you know, morally corrupt to me. I mean, I think that. To me, there's no separation between, and so this is highly anecdotal or stipulated or personal, but I don't make any distinction between aesthetics and morals. Like, what you find is beautiful is, you know, when you're presenting something as beautiful, you are, whether you like it or not, presenting your moral values. And to me, they're just to me as an artist, any distinction between them is meaningless or evasive, you know. I don't know if that answers the question. But
can I just add to that?
Sir.
I think that you left out Shakespeare from that list, because I think look, I mean, the point being that, you know, artist is also a participant in the world, right? And he takes the constraints that he has, right? So I mean, in Shakespeare's time, the constraint was that he had to sell, right? He had to fill up the auditorium, so he had to give something to people who would fill it up and make money for people running the globe. And so, you know, but, you know, in that he was able to subvert that as well, right? And I think that really is what a big artist does. That, you know, I mean, take Ghalib as well. You know, he was a pensioner of the state, you know, qaside likh rahe hain. You know, he would do all of that. He would participate in all of that. But at the same time, he was able to in some sense subvert that as well, right? He's able to create an opening whereby you cannot simply reduce their work to that particular statement. And I think that reduction is, when you are able to reduce a work of art to a particular statement, that's when you run into the propaganda territory. If you are unable to reduce it, when you are able to come away with a more complex experience, and again, all the filmmakers that you've named, you know, give you that sort of experience. And I think that what is perhaps happening is something else. They're working within constraints that they have, and they're kind of offering you something that is more complex. But having said that, I think that what Paul is saying, I'm with that. I think, you know, ethics is something that we kind of leave out in our conversation completely, and I think it should really be at the heart of all our conversations, whether they are about art, whether they're about science, whether they are about diplomacy, whether they are, I mean, what are the aims that are, you know, any of these serving? And I think that's an important question to ask, actually.
Thank you, Bilal. We have time, I think, for one more question. Can we have the mic here for the lady in the front? Let's keep some gender balance here also.
My question would be to the cultural attaché here, because as I understand it, as a representative of the government of the United States, you also have a political objective, inevitably. So how would you reconcile that objective, I mean, using art as an instrument of that political objective, from the value of art for art's sake?
Thank you. As I mentioned, in our case, the U.S. government, cultural diplomacy is inclusive of art and many other things, and they are very directly in support of foreign policy goals. So actually everyone on this panel is a product of cultural exchange, and so that would be in support of the openness of dialogue, the strengthening of civil society and its role in building democratic and free societies, in harmonious interaction between diversity of thought and, let's say, diversity within society, acknowledging that there could be similarities and differences and that both can coexist, and all of those are highly compatible with our goals. So you're very accurate. When cultural diplomacy is doing the right thing, it's totally in support of our policy goals.
Thank you, Judith. One last question, one short last question. Gigi.
My name is Shahid Nadeem from Ajoka Theatre. I don't have a question, just I want to share just two examples of cultural diplomacy in action practiced by non-diplomats. For last 25 years, we have been interacting with our counterparts in India and performing in India, even in sometimes very difficult circumstances, inviting groups from India to Pakistan. And more recently, we were able to perform in Washington at the Georgetown University a play called America Chalo, which was about the experience of Pakistani visa applicants in the visa section of US Embassy. It was political satire, quite hard-hitting, critical of Pakistani double standards, but also critical of US double speak or double standards. And among the audience were officials of the State Department, including Ambassador Hoagland and Pakistani ambassador. They all had a great time. They laughed together at themselves and the double standards or the contradictions. And I think we created more space, more understanding without being propagandists. So I just wanted to tell you that cultural diplomacy can be very entertaining and still very successful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to thank the panelists.
Can I say one thing?
Ji.
So thank you, because that's, I think that's the key, that anyone who participates on a cultural exchange becomes the cultural ambassador. And people will begin to see the country that they represent through everything that they do. So I agree with you. Cultural exchange is sustainable and builds these long-lasting relationships through the people themselves.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and to the audience for turning up on a Sunday morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha.
I would like to thank our honorable panelists, Paul Harding, Judith, Ravin, Fizza, Hassan, Bilal, Tanweer, and of course Ayesha, Fazlur, Rahman, for providing us such an insightful session. Thanks for devoting your time. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session will be Ahmed Faraz, the poet, as a witness to the age, and see you then.